Thank you all for joining the Ecological Landscape Alliance today in our webinar with Leslie Duthie as we explore some clandestine orchids. I want to take some time to introduce Leslie to everyone. She's a lifelong gardener and she was formerly employed at Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, where she was the horticulturist and plant propagator for over 38 years. She's an accomplished grower of ferns and wildflowers, which her love of began when she first learned how to raise them from spores. Now she's retired, but she still volunteers at various gardens and works to protect land for her local conservation commission and land trust. And without further ado, Leslie, please take it away.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm glad you all could join us today. This was part of the Wednesday walks in the garden, but I wanted to talk a little bit about ELA, the Ecological Landscape Alliance. The alliance is made of a group of professional gardeners, home gardeners, designers, landscape architects, and landscape companies that focus on ecological practices and sustainable landscapes. The Alliance offers something for everyone. So if you're not a current member, this is a great organization with lots of information. We have recently revamped our mission and vision, and they reflect the aims to be inclusive and inspirational. We are spreading the word on new techniques to help everyone, from the beginner to the professional. Membership is really critical. We have a fabulous member database with lots of different kinds of people who are members of ELA, but we love the additional support. It supports the organization and provides many member-free programs like this one that you can find in our database. This is where you would go to become a member. We are at www.ecolandscaping.org/membership. We have some great events coming up. Another great reason to become a member. You can get the member price for these particular events in October. So in just a month or so away, we will be presenting the Seasons End Summit. Are we getting it right? Observations on the ecological landscape. We've got some wonderful speakers. You can see the lineup in kind of small print here. That will take place on Thursday, October 27th. It is a hybrid event. So if you are in Massachusetts or close to Boylston, Massachusetts, you can attend in person at the New England Botanic Garden. Or if you would prefer, you can attend virtually, and that would be found in the registration for this program. We also have two other conferences coming up this fall. The Regenerative Solutions for the Resilient Landscape will take place at Longwood Gardens in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. This is our Mid-Atlantic Conference. And that conference is an in-person only event, and there will be more information coming shortly on this particular conference. And finally, in December, we will be presenting at the Ecological Plant Conference, which typically takes place at New York Botanic Garden in New York City. So please be on the lookout for more information and registration for these events, should you be interested. When someone says orchid, the expectation is that we are talking about tropical epiphytic plants that are growing in a conservatory. Plants and flowers that you see here, like Miltoniopsis, Cattleya, Phalaenopsis, or Oncidium. These plants are usually grown in rock or bark mixes, and some require very high humidity. They're beautiful to look at, and some are fairly easy to grow, while others can be quite challenging. However, today we're going to talk about the orchids of New England. We're going to focus on some of the more elusive cousins of these greenhouse beauties. Orchids in New England are terrestrial. They're growing in soils, and they are elusive because they are sometimes very challenging to find. Some have very large, showy flowers, as you can see here, and some are kind of surprises that you come across in the forest. So in my travels through parts of New England, I have come upon some very beautiful patches of orchids, and I'm going to share some of those experiences with you. So first, I'd like to talk about the botany of orchids a little bit. I always find this is kind of helpful for people to sort of help them know what they are looking for. So orchids are, of course, the genus Orchid falls in the Orchidaceae, and these are actually considered monocots. They are a large group of plants. They include things like the grasses, the lilies, and plants such as trillium would be in this group. But one of the easy ways of telling that you're looking at monocots is by looking at the veination in the leaves. Their veins are parallel rather than being net formed. So that's a very helpful ID characteristic. There are approximately 20 genera of orchids in New England that are terrestrial orchids in New England. Some of them are only found pretty far north. Some of them are found throughout our region. They're not simple or regular. They have a shape that cannot be equally divided in all planes, such as what we would consider a regular flower, or we also call those actinomorphic flowers. So that's zygomorphic and actinomorphic are words that mean regular and irregular. Floral guides can be misleading or outright deceptive, and pollen is found in clumps or groups and stick together. So they make a larger clump. But for plant hybridizers, that's a really important fact. When we go back to, and don't go backwards with the slides, but when we think about our tropical orchids and the amount of work that's been done with tropical orchids, hybridization has been really a key feature. So being able to collect those pollen grains as pollinia or clumps of pollen and then actually deposit them on a stigma. We found that the stigmas of orchids are not very fussy. They don't only look for their own species. So often you will get hybrids between two kinds of orchids. So here's a good example of that parallel veined leaf. These are both lady slippers or Cypripedium, which we'll talk about a lot more lately. And you can see that the veins are parallel on the leaves. Their flowers are not regular, so picture an aster or a daisy where you could literally cut that flower in half in almost any direction and end up with equal parts on both sides. These flowers are considered irregular because there's only one plane along which you can cut the flower and have two equal parts. So that is those parallel veins you find in many of our grass species. Grasses, of course, are what we typically think about when we think about monocots, but there are quite a few species that fall under this type of plant. So you can see the parallel veins, and this is Carex plantaginea, or the plantain-leafed sedge. It's got the same parallel veins that you would see in either of these orchids. So the flowers vary widely. Some of them look more like insects, or some of them can be quite showy. They can be very challenging to find in the wild because of that trait. So this is where I was going to talk about the pollen being sort of clumpy, but orchids are visited by a wide variety of insects. Typically, you'll get generalist pollinators coming to many of them, but often they are fooled by the orchids, and they will offer sometimes they can offer wonderful rewards, and sometimes they are very deceptive. So on most of our orchids, there is a lip that acts as a landing pad, and then there are guides for the pollinators that would guide the insects along to the pollen reward. But some species do not offer rewards, and sometimes they trick the insects that visit into picking up these pollinia and moving them to other orchids so that they can cross-pollinate. Some of our orchids are very specialized, requiring only one kind of pollinator. So I have a really good story about this. Flowers have evolved so that they can attract the right kinds of pollinators. And there is an example not in the orchid family that I'm going to share with you. There's a plant, and its name is going to come to me. It's got a very small flower. It's dogbane, and dogbane has a very small white flower, and the flower has evolved to favor long-tongued pollinators. So it's really looking for a butterfly or a bee to come and visit the flowers to be an effective pollinator for this plant. And they all have long enough tongues so that they can reach down into the flower and get the nectar reward while still while touching the pollen and being able to take the pollen to another dogbane plant where it will cross pollinate. Flies have very short tongues, and flies are not as effective as a pollinator for the dogbane. But the dogbane has evolved so that if a short-tongued pollinator comes to the flower, they actually trap the insect by the tongue. So the flies may land on the flower and try to drink from that flower, but there's a trap and the flower will hold them by the tongue. They cannot get the nectar reward, and they are not good enough pollinators to be accepted by this plant. So the flies literally hang there by their tongues, dying in within reach of nectar because the plant has trapped them. So some flowers have very specialized requirements and attract only very few species of pollinators. It's not often that I see flies hanging on the dogbane, but if they are not wise enough to know that it's not a good flower for them, they can become trapped. Some species mimic the scents of females, bees, flies, or wasps, and they actually attract insects, which will, essentially copulate with the flowers in order to pollinate it. So here you can see the cryptostylus. This is the plant that mimics the scent of certain a female bee and will attract bees, the male bees to it in order to become pollinated. This is a tropical orchid. This is not one that we find here in our area. Calopogon or grass pink orchid is definitely one that's found in our area. And if you look sort of closely at this picture of this pink flower, the lower photograph, that center lip that's above the flower is sort of folded over. And when it opens up, it literally provides a landing pad for pollinators who land at the very top of the flower. And then they follow the trails down through the stamens in order to reach the female parts, the stigma of the orchid, so that they can pollinate the different plants. And of course, the lady slipper has lots of guides right there in the center. All those red dots are sort of pointing down into the slipper, and they are saying, to the insects, please land here, come here. This is where we want you to be. They walk over all of the parts, and yet, even though they have all these guides for the insects, they provide no reward whatsoever. So why do I call them clandestine orchids? So clandestines means kept secret or covert. But I often think of orchids as being ephemeral. They do not that they last for a very short time, and actually the synonyms, which are hard to read here, transitory and fleeting and are short-lived, are all good examples of how I think about orchids in the wild. Uh, one year you can find many orchids along the path, and they're everywhere, and you see all these beautiful plants all blooming and doing really wonderfully. You can return the next year and there'll be none in that same patch. So where did they go? They just kind of seem to hide. And we will talk about some of the techniques that orchids use to really take advantage of climate, habitat, and their conditions, so that they may show up in unusual ways or irregular ways. Many species also seem to find places to hide within the forest. Their flowers can be discreet, or blend in with the flora that exists there. Or sometimes their flowers can resemble insects, and it makes them harder for us to pick out. They are ephemeral, and they show up randomly. Uh, so, what makes them so fleeting? We will explore this a little further. The other thing about orchids is that they produce very tiny dust-like seeds that are spread by the wind. The seeds of the orchid species, the orchid family, have no endosperm, so they rely on getting nutrients for germination from mycorrhizal fungi, which means that they have to land in very particular places. And this is another reason why orchids can be very clandestine, is because germination is very challenging for them. Many of our orchids, terrestrial and tropical, are raised in laboratory culture in order for the plants to really grow and thrive. And by using laboratory culture, those mycorrhizal fungi can be introduced into the tube where the orchid seeds have been placed to help germination and to provide nutrition for that very small seedling. But if you think about it, it's not very often that we go into the woods and see lots of seedlings of plants such as orchids. So we're going to talk about some of the different species that we see in New England, and some of the ones that I personally have come across. So Cypripedium is the lady slipper orchid. This one is probably our most common. This is the pink lady slipper, or Cypripedium acali. Again, those very prominent parallel veins. So this is a plant that I have seen on and off throughout much of my life here in New England. So why is it that some years I can come across a large patch of lady slippers and then not see them for several years? Well, the truth is that, number one, these particular plants, Cypripedium acali, relies on a fungus in the soil. And it's the abundance of that fungus that nourishes the plant and encourages the plant. The second reason that these plants seem to come and go is that they are really plants of disturbance. So, having been a horticulturalist and a gardener for forever, um, I remember periods of time, and actually we had one not that long ago, where we've had gypsy moth defoliation. Certainly, this happened for me for the first time in the 80s, where the gypsy moths came through Massachusetts and completely defoliated some of our oak forests. And then the next year, we had a lot of growth of pink lady slipper orchids, and that's because the orchids sense that something was different when the so they're we used to call them gypsy moths. They're now known as spongy moths. The spongy moths defoliated the trees, allowing a lot more light down to the surface of the soils. Now, whether this stimulated the growth of the fungus or just really signaled to these orchids that there was more light available for them, so they all reappeared. So when there's a change in the forest, whether it's actual defoliation or actual harvesting of wood products from the forest, these plants like disturbance. So they will sometimes appear in the woods after an event such as that. Another cypripedium is this is Cypripedium parviflorum. We also have Cypripedium pubescens, which is the large yellow lady slipper. This is the small yellow lady slipper. The large yellow lady slipper has a bigger flower, and the twirls, the parts of the flower that are maroon in this photograph, tend to be more of a greenish color in the large yellow lady slipper. Large yellow lady slipper is endangered in Massachusetts. We don't see it very often, and I almost never come across the small lady slipper in the forest as well. And part of the reason for that is these are lime-loving species. So typically, or more commonly, you would find these orchids in the western parts of our New England states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and in parts of Vermont, where they could take advantage of the limestone bedrock that we have in those locations. These are probably associated with a fungus as well, but they are not as attached to that, or they don't need that fungus nearly as much as the pink lady slipper. So this species is able to grow a little bit more freely in the garden. Of course, we never collect orchids from the wild. We only buy from reputable growers. We make sure we find someone who is propagating or dividing or caring for these plants rather than collecting them from the wild. One of our most desired lady slippers is the uh, um, showy lady slipper, Cypripedium regalis. And this species is more common farther north. And this species really is fond of growing in wet locations. So this is a plant that likes not just any swamp, but prefers a fen, again, where there's a higher pH and water consistently through the year. This was a very bad year for seeing the showy lady slipper because we had such a dry season. But there are a number of locations in Vermont and up into Maine where I've been fortunate enough to see these lady slippers. The showy lady slipper can get to be up to 3 feet tall, so it can be an enormous plant when it's growing in the right location. These do tend to like sort of beaver impoundments where the trees might have been removed from the collection of plants from the habitat, or at least where the trees are a little bit more sparse. So again, a plant that really prefers disturbance in its habitat. It likes when the water levels are changing a little bit and maybe some of those bigger trees are dying off, allowing more light in. Terry, do you want to ask a question?
There's actually a conservancy area in Vermont open to the public that has a great showing of these. And I also was going to ask, but thought you might get to it. There's a white lady slipper
Yes.
that is a lot in New England.
Yes. So there is is it Cypripedium albidum? It is a white one, and I have seen it periodically. Unfortunately, I don't have pictures. Do you remember the name of the conservancy? It's a property that belongs to the Nature Conservancy, but New
I'll,
England.
I'll, I'll look it up on my phone and get it to you by the end.
Okay, New England Wildflower or the Native Plant Trust is also a caretaker of the property, and I have been there to see them. But that would be good for other members of the audience to know. So the next orchid I'd like to talk about is another spring bloomer, and that's Isotria verticillata. This is one of those plants that you could really miss. It's not always obvious in the forest, and this is a plant that you can see that there is quite a lovely population in several areas where I've been. I live in the town of Munson, Massachusetts, and on our Flint quarry lands, our natural area that's been preserved in town, there is a population of these plants. But you can also see these at the New England Botanic Garden, located in Boylston, Massachusetts. They have quite a population there. I love this plant. It's so unusual. It's not common to see one with two flowers on it. So that was the picture I wanted to share with you. But this one, you can see this one looks more like an insect than it does like a flower. They blend into the forest. They look very much like the Indian cucumber root, which is Mediola, and but this is Isotria verticillata. This is a great plant to look for in the early spring, and you can find them in copious populations. Its cousin, Isotria medioloides, which sounds like the Mediola virginica, I think it is. Sounds like Indian cucumber root. is a smaller world begonia, and that one is considered rare in Massachusetts. I have been fortunate enough to see it. I didn't get a chance to photograph it, but there are only a couple of populations of that particular orchid. This is Coloriza maculata, or the spotted coral orchid. It's another one that's very, that blends in very well. It can be very challenging to find. I actually took this photograph in Alaska when we were visiting there a couple of years ago. But you can find this in New England. I have seen it here as well. It's a really unusual orchid. It's small. It's only about 4 inches tall, and it really blends in the landscape. It can be a very challenging one to find. And it seems this is another plant that seems to be sort of ephemeral. It appears some years, and other years you don't see it. When I worked at the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, it came up a couple of times in some sort of unusual areas, and it would be very fleeting. It would appear, and then I wouldn't see it for years. So I wonder if this one too relies on either disturbance, or maybe it's more likely on the soil chemistry, whether it's got the right mycorrhizae fungus growing with it. But one of the key things about these orchids is that they can remain dormant in the soil for years, 5, 10, even longer, and then appear when the conditions are right. So orchids really take advantage of the conditions around them and the habitat around them, and they wait for the proper conditions in order to appear. Calopogon tuberosus, or the grass pink orchid. This is really one of my favorites. I love to see this plant blooming. I showed you this earlier when we were talking about having that lip that the plants, that the pollinators will land on. In this particular case, the lip is at the top instead of at the bottom, where we typically expect to find a lip on a plant. But they're really quite lovely. This is growing. There's a pretty abundant population at the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, and it is really wonderful to see when it's blooming in June. We've sort of gone through the seasons so far with the plants, starting with the Cypripedium, the lady slippers, and coming up to Calopogon, or the grass pink. This one's blooming just as summer is arriving. This is a plant often of the pine barrens. And here it is with the colic root, Elytris farinosa, and it's or Elytris glutinosa. And they really make a lovely combination in the garden. This is a natural area at the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary. Pogonia ophioglossoides, or the rose pogonia, is another species that we used to have growing at the Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary. It was growing with the Calopogon and the Elytris. So it was just a member of that same group. I fear that these have been dormant for quite a long time. They're a smaller orchid. They're only they're only within that 6-inch range of height. So they have to compete with a lot of larger species in the Pine Barrens garden at Norcross. But another really beautiful orchid that's blooming in the June season. So here's a plant, Epipactis helleborine, which is not native to New England. This is one that's pretty common, that we see around in natural areas pretty regularly. It's known as the broad-leafed helleborine. It has these purpley green flowers. They're very showy, very attractive. They definitely remind you of an orchid, and they're definitely plants that we find quite regularly in New England. Their roots are quite deep. They come from quite deep down in the forest. This has not been a good year for this orchid either. I did not see a lot of them in June, July, and August, which is a typical time for them to bloom. So some people feel that this is a weed, a non-native. a plant that could potentially take over and take habitat from our native orchids. So I do know people who pull it out and try to keep it from thriving in our forests. But it still is very pretty. Oh, thank you very much. Eshqua Bog is where you can go to see the showy lady slipper, and that's located in Heartland, Vermont. So this is a plant that we come across periodically, but like I said, some people feel it could compete with our native orchids, so they like to remove it. I have kind of mixed feelings about that. I think it's a very pretty plant. I find it too can be very ephemeral. Sometimes it shows up in certain locations, other times we don't see it at all. I've only seen a few plants. I would never characterize this plant as quote unquote taking over or spreading too quickly, because I have not seen it form large colonies and displacing other species. So I try to appreciate it for its flowers and its orchid appearance in our woodlands without necessarily removing it. Platanthera is our largest genus of flowering orchids in New England. There are quite a number of them that we can find in the wild. And these, just like our other orchids, can be very fleeting. This is Platanthera grandiflora, or the greater purple fringed orchid. And I saw this one growing at Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary, and then it disappeared, and it hasn't come back. And I'm wondering if it's waiting for the canopy to open up a little bit and really allow some more light in. Along with Platanthera grandiflora, there's Platanthera psychotes, which is the smaller purple fringed orchid. I also have seen that one at Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary as well. So these are, okay, let's see, State Park in Northwood, New Hampshire is where I saw the white lady slippers. So Platanthera usually forms a raceme, which is a stalk of many flowers, and they can be very fringy. And we'll see some flower variations on the Platanthera species. Platanthera blepharoglottis is the white prairie orchid, and we used to have that one at Norcross, and I have seen that one in New England, but I believe it's more common to our west. Here's another Platanthera. This is Platanthera ciliaris. It's an orange fringed orchid. There is a second orange orchid, which is Platanthera, I think it's ciliata, not ciliaris, which is also found in New England. The ciliaris, Platanthera ciliaris, this particular orchid is considered extirpated in Massachusetts. It's a little bit more common in Connecticut and farther south. But what a wonderful species to come across. I loved the color and the showiness of the flowers. These are a little bit more frilly than the larger purple fringed orchid, but still quite exquisite and in that same raceme style of flower. This is another one I came across, no fringe. This one is now called the little club spur orchid, even though it's still in the Platanthera genus. Platanthera clavellata is a plant that I came across again at Norcross in some of our bog areas. These plants tend to like areas that are seepy or damp throughout much of the season and really grow and thrive in wetter areas. And this this is still the clavellata hiding in the shrubs, the vegetation on the site. And this is Platanthera lacera, known as the green fringe orchid. Now we've gone from one extreme to the other. So here's the very fringy orchid that was really challenging to find. You can see in your photograph on the left that it really blended in quite well with the other plants and other foliage that were around it. And I was able to get an isolated picture of the plant. But look at how tiny the petals are, and really what a spectacular little plant this is in the garden. So these are things that also make orchids more clandestine, is that they kind of hide in the habitats, and you really have to keep an eye out for some of these plants. I was literally walking along at a dirt road and came across this, and it would have been very easy to overlook as I was walking through. So Platanthera has the most different, has the largest number of species of all of our native orchids. Goodyear pubescens is one that we see quite often. This plant really loves undisturbed forest floors. And you can see the foliage on the left. It has very distinctive foliage. We don't always see it in bloom, but I often see it crawling across the floor. It does not like to be disturbed. It likes to have sort of an area where it's not bothered and not dealing with a lot of competition. But this is pretty common in our denser forests. And you can find very large patches of it. Sometimes you only see a couple of plants like this, but sometimes you can see a patch that's 3 to 5 feet across. Really amazing to see these plants in the wild forming these larger colonies. And this is a plant that blooms later in the season. So now is the time that I would be expecting to find flowers on the Goodyear pubescens. They have these really small, almost round flowers that are very indistinct, but the stalk is about a foot tall. So where the foliage remains close to the floor on this species, the flower stalk stands right up and is quite noticeable. I spend a lot of time looking down, because if I don't look down, I'll trip and fall. I like to listen to the birds, but I don't see them as often. But this is a great plant to notice while you're walking and looking down. They really will, um, you know, form a lovely mat on the forest floor. The last orchid that I'm going to talk about today is Spiranthes, or the lady's tresses. We do have 2 species that are found in New England. The first one being Spiranthes cernua, or the autumn lady's tresses, which is really a pretty common plant. So they have green uh, rosette forming leaves at their base. I don't have any pictures of their leaves because their flowers were much prettier. So they're very innocuous. You could easily walk past them during most times of the year. But this is a fall blooming orchid. And then we have Spiranthes vernalis. So this was growing in a field. It seems to like, this is another species that likes change. It comes up where there have been fires, or where you have grasses that get mowed periodically, and will appear in a field. This one is a spring to fall blooming orchid. I've seen it in May and June, but I understand that they came across it at the Norcross Sanctuary last August. So again, it can bloom at different times. So when we think about our orchids, I want to remind you that they are not necessarily delicate species, but they are they are fleeting. And part of the reason is because they seem to find places where they want to grow. Unfortunately, this is the plant that we have to really appreciate in our wild areas and our natural areas. So you should go out looking for these and not want them in your garden, because they really live in very particular habitats. So they're ecologically sensitive, and they can be fleeting. They can be very challenging to move. I'm sure that many of you have heard the stories of moving the pink lady slipper, a very obvious plant. Sometimes we want to move it out of the path of destruction. And I've heard stories of people digging huge sods of plants, so that they could get all of the mycorrhizae fungi with it. And then I've heard stories of people saying, oh no, you just have to find a place where other pink lady slippers are growing, and then you can just take the plant out with its roots and move it to that site. In both situations, transplanting has not been tremendously successful. And really moving these beautiful plants from the places where they have chosen to live can be quite detrimental. You can find information on where to see orchids. Eshqua Bog, and in New Hampshire, you had a site, and I have listed several places that you can visit. The Norcross Wildlife Sanctuary is located in the town of Wales, Massachusetts. New England Botanic Garden. They have some species of non-native orchids in their gardens as well. The Shade Garden is a garden that contains many Asiatic species, and they have some unusual terrestrial orchids there. But they also have pink lady slippers, and of course the larger world pogonia, which you can see in springtime. And of course, Garden in the Woods, the Native Plant Trust main garden, located in Framingham. And although Eshqua Bog is owned by the Nature Conservancy, the Native Plant Trust does a lot of work up there monitoring plants. And it's actually a really wonderful place to go to see a wide variety of unusual species. Eshqua Bog is a fen, and there's a lot of limestone soil there. So people can, you can see some of those more unusual lime-loving plants that we don't typically see in central New England. So it's a great place to visit as well. Any other questions?
Leslie, can you give a list of the lime-loving orchids? And also, could you please explain the difference between a bog and a fen?
Sure. So a bog can be more acidic in nature. A
Right.
fen is always a limestone site. And so when we think about the western part of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and parts of Vermont, we're getting into the Appalachian Mountain Range. And of course, millions of years ago, that was the coastline. And when Africa came up and ran into North America, it thrust up the Appalachian Mountains. And of course, millions of years ago, they were very high peaked mountains. And through the eons, erosion has taken place. And that former seashore that was made into a mountain now has a lot of limestone in it. So marble from Vermont is compressed limestone, and the extreme western parts of Connecticut and Massachusetts have lime soils. And those wet spots, those marshes that are limey, are known as fens. So in terms of a list of lime-loving orchids, really the yellow lady slipper is the primary one that I think about. But there are some more unusual species that are, the showy lady slipper would be another one.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, well, if you have any questions that you think of later, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer your questions.
All right. If there aren't any more questions, thank you so much, Leslie, for your time and for sharing your knowledge with us today. I learned so much about orchids. Mainly that there are some native to the Northeast. I never would have expected that.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Leslie, for your time.
Sure, my pleasure. Again, my email was there. So if you have a question later on in time, you're welcome to reach out.
Yes, and I just put Leslie's email in the chat, and I'm putting mine in the chat too. If anyone has any questions about ELA, feel free to send them my way. And any plant questions, Leslie's your girl.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Have a nice afternoon.